April 4th, 1945. The air over northern Germany is thin, freezing and lethal. 24,000 feet above the cloud layer, the formation of the 448th Bomb Group pushes toward Kiel, their contrails marking a stark white path through the chaotic sky. Inside the cramped rear station of a B-17 flying fortress, Staff Sergeant Arizona Harris kneels behind his twin 50-caliber machine guns, his world reduced to the narrow cone of visibility behind the bomber. The vibration of the airframe usually masks everything, but today the sensation is different. The German fighters, appearing at 6 o'clock, are not firing and breaking away in standard intercept patterns. They are holding their lines. They are closing at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, with a terrifying mechanical fixation. Suddenly, the world dissolves into violence. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 slams directly into the bomber's fuselage. The impact force so catastrophic that it shears the entire tail section cleanly away from the rest of the plane. The main fuselage tumbles forward. The severed tail section drops instantly into the void, spinning uncontrollably toward the earth 4 miles below. But in that plummeting wreckage, amidst the screaming wind and the pull of gravity, a sound cuts through the silence. The twin guns in the falling tail begin to roar. Arizona Harris is still fighting. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was not merely losing the war, it was disintegrating. On the ground, the map of Europe was being rewritten daily. From the east, the Soviet Red Army had amassed along the Oder River, their artillery already within hearing distance of Berlin's outskirts. To the west, American and British armored columns had breached the Rhine barrier and were fanning out across the German heartland. The thousand-year Reich, once stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga, had been compressed into a narrow burning corridor of Central Europe. For the airmen of the United States Army Air Forces stationed in England, the strategic picture appeared deceptively simple. Absolute supremacy. The Luftwaffe, the once invincible shield of Germany, had been decimated. By April, Allied fighters roamed German airspace with near impunity, while the heavy bomber streams, the big friends, delivered crushing payloads to cities that were already largely reduced to rubble. However, the statistical dominance of the Allies masked a terrifying reality for the bomber crews. A wounded animal is most dangerous in its final moments, and the Nazi leadership, fueled by fanaticism and fearing the approaching retribution, refused to capitulate. While the organized fighter wings of the Luftwaffe had been shattered, the scattered remnants were becoming unpredictable. The rigid, disciplined intercept tactics of 1943 had dissolved into something far more erratic and desperate. The skies over Germany were no longer a contest of strategy. They had become a chaotic arena where the rules of engagement were being discarded entirely. The mission on April 4th was designated as a maximum effort by the 8th Air Force. The target was the port city of Kiel, situated in the far north on the Baltic coast. Despite the ruined state of German industry, Kiel remained a critical nerve center, housing the vast shipyards and submarine pens. The Allies could not afford to let these vessels put to sea. Consequently, the 8th Air Force launched a massive armada, over 1,400 heavy bombers, escorted by nearly 900 P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. The 448th Bombardment Group, flying out of seething England, was just one cog in this colossal machine. For the crews waking up in the pre-dawn darkness, the briefing was routine, but the atmosphere was heavy with exhaustion. These men were flying their final missions of the war. counting down the days until they could go home, as the B-17 flying fortresses roared down the runways and clawed their way through the English overcast. They assembled into their combat boxes, intricate, three-dimensional defensive formations designed to overlap fields of fire. Yet, as they crossed the North Sea and turned toward the German coast, the crews began to notice anomalies. The radio chatter was sparse. The expected swarms of German jet fighters did not materialize in force. Instead, the radar screens and the spotters began to pick up a different kind of threat. It wasn't the coordinated sweep of a fighter wing, but rather sporadic, high-speed contacts converging from multiple directions. The Luftwaffe High Command, stripped of fuel, and experienced pilots had turned to a strategy born of absolute nihilism. They had scraped together every available airframe, stripped them of non-essential armor, and filled the cockpits with young ideological volunteers. The mission profile for the German defenders on this day was not to shoot down the bombers in a conventional dogfight. The order was much simpler and infinitely more horrifying. While the Americans flew with the calculated precision of a winning army, the German response was being forged in chaos. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was paralyzed. What remained was a surplus of machines and a deficit of hope. In this vacuum, a new and terrifying doctrine emerged, championed by Oberst Harvey Hermann. His solution was the Ramjäger, the battering ram. He argued that if the German air defenses could not shoot down the Allied bomber streams, they must physically smash them out of the sky. The logic was brutal and mathematically cold. Trading one cheap light fighter and one young pilot for a 4-engine heavy bomber and its 10-man crew was considered a favorable exchange for the Reich. Thus, Sonderkommando Elbe was born. The unit was composed not of seasoned veterans but of teenagers, zealous graduates who had barely enough flight training to keep a plane level. They were strapped into Messerschmitt Bf-109s that had been stripped of armor, radio equipment, and all non-essential weight. The tactical instruction was simple: climb to 35,000 feet, dive vertically into the bomber stream, and aim for the empennage, the tail section. The pilots were told to slice through the B-17S like a guillotine. While they were theoretically permitted to bail out after the collision, the physics of a mid-air impact at 400 miles per hour made this a hollow promise. To understand the tragedy and the heroism of April 4th, one must first understand the machine. The B-17 Flying Fortress was the backbone of the American Air War, a 30-ton giant bristling with 13 heavy machine guns. By 1945, the G model was the definitive version. Engineers had added a chin turret to the nose, but the most crucial evolution was at the very rear of the aircraft, the Cheyenne tail turret. This was not merely a gun emplacement. It was a marvel of pragmatic engineering. It housed twin M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. But for all its lethality, the tail position was a solitary confinement cell. This was the domain of Staff Sergeant Arizona T. Harris. Raised in Tempe, Arizona, Harris was a young man occupying the most physically and psychologically demanding position in the crew. While the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier sat together in the heated forward cabin, the tail gunner was segregated. He knelt on a small seat at the very end of the fuselage, separated from the rest of the crew by a long, narrow tunnel. At 24,000 feet, the environment inside that aluminum cone was hostile to human life. The temperature hovered near 40 degrees below zero. Frost formed on the eyebrows and oxygen masks. Harris was plugged into the aircraft's life support systems. An electrically heated suit to prevent his blood from freezing, and an oxygen hose to keep him conscious. If either system failed, he would be dead in minutes. But the isolation was not just physical. It was visual. Everyone else on the plane looked forward, watching the target approaching. The tail gunner watched the world recede. He was the guardian of the dead six, the blind spot directly behind the bomber where fighters loved to stalk. For hours, Harris would stare into the empty blue void. On this specific morning, Harris was flying in a B-17 named Harvey's Horse, piloted by Second Lieutenant Robert Bixby. They were flying the Purple Heart corner, the low outside position of the formation, statistically the most vulnerable spot. As the formation tightened up, the tension in the tail was palpable. Harris wasn't just a passenger. He was the shield for the 9 other men in front of him. Opposing Arizona Harris was a pilot operating in a completely different psychological and mechanical reality. While the American crew worked as a coordinated team, the German pilot of the Sonderkommando Elbe was utterly alone. He was strapped into a Messerschmitt that had been reduced to little more than an engine and a seat. These pilots were not hunting. They were engaging in a ballistic equation. The tactical doctrine required a terrifying suppression of the survival instinct. The ramming attack required an overshoot speed of nearly 150 miles per hour, greater than the target. From the cockpit of the Bf-109, the B-17 did not look like an airplane. It looked like a slow-moving silver skyscraper suspended in the sky. As the German pilot initiated his attack run, he would push his throttle past the detent into war emergency power. The closing speed was the critical variable. The B-17 was traveling at roughly 160 miles per hour. The diving Messerschmitt was doing over 400. At that differential, the bomber grew in the windscreen with nightmarish speed. The instruction was precise. Use the propeller as a buzzsaw. Slice through the vertical stabilizer. But as the fleets converged over the freezing waters of the Kiel Canal, theory collided with reality. The sky was not a chalkboard. It was a 3-dimensional hell of flak bursts, prop wash, and adrenaline. The approach to Kiel began under a deceptive calm, but at 12:13 p.m., the rhythm broke. The spotters called out bandits, not the usual high-altitude swarms, but singular, aggressive contacts diving from the contrail layer above. The German flak batteries around Kiel opened up, painting the sky with black smudges of exploding shells. But the flak was quickly forgotten as the Sonderkommando Elbe began their run. From his position in the tail, Staff Sergeant Arizona Harris saw them first. They appeared as dark silhouettes against the bright glare of the sun. Standard Luftwaffe tactics dictated that they should level off, fire, and roll away. Harris gripped his spade handles, traversing the twin .50 calibers to track the nearest Messerschmitt. He depressed the triggers. The heavy machine guns thundered, shaking the entire tail section. Tracers reached out toward the diving fighter. Harris saw strikes. Debris flew off the German fighter's wing. Smoke began to trail from its engine. In any other stage of the war, a damaged fighter would break off. But this fighter did not turn. A wave of confusion surely washed over the crew. The enemy plane wasn't firing its cannons. It was simply holding its course, growing larger by the second, accelerating in a suicide dive directly at the formation. The closure rate was sickening. The German pilot had committed to the collision course. Harris didn't flinch. While other gunners might have frozen at the sight of a plane refusing to die, Harris kept his thumbs pressed down. The barrels of his Brownings grew hot. He was pouring a wall of steel directly into the path of the oncoming machine. He was the last line of defense, and he was holding the trigger. The German fighter roared through the defensive box of the 448th Bomb Group, missed the wingman, and zeroed in on the B-17 at the bottom of the formation, Harvey's horse. The collision is instantaneous and catastrophic. The Messerschmitt strikes Harvey's horse just forward of the horizontal stabilizers. The violence of the impact defies description. In a fraction of a second, the structural integrity of the B-17 is overwhelmed. The sheer kinetic energy of the German fighter acts like a guillotine. The duralumin skin rips, the stringers snap, and the entire tail section of the bomber, containing Arizona Harris and his turret, is sheared cleanly away from the main fuselage. The forward section of the bomber, now rudderless and unbalanced, pitches violently forward, tumbling into an uncontrollable spin. The main wreckage begins its death spiral toward the earth, but behind it, the severed tail section hangs suspended for a heartbeat before gravity claims it. It is a jagged, broken piece of metal, tumbling end over end in the slipstream. Inside this spinning coffin, the G-forces must be crushing. The centrifugal force alone should render a man unconscious. The cold air at 24,000 feet rushes in through the torn metal, freezing everything instantly. By all laws of physiology and physics, Arizona Harris should be dead. He is neither. Crews in nearby bombers, watching in horror through their plexiglass, witness a sight that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the tail section plummets, spinning wildly through the formation, the twin barrels of the machine guns are still tracking. Harris is not just holding on. He is engaging. Whether driven by a final surge of adrenaline, a refusal to accept the inevitable, or a muscle memory drilled into him until it became reflex, Harris keeps fighting. As the German fighter spins away damage, the severed tail section continues to spit fire. Traces erupt from the falling turret, lashing out at the enemy in a defiant arc. Down and down he goes. 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. The tail section is a lonely meteor, trailing smoke and empty shell casings. Observers see the muzzle flashes pulsing rhythmically, a strobe light in the grey sky, all the way until the wreckage disappears into the cloud layer below. Arizona Harris rides the broken piece of his aircraft all the way to the ground, firing his weapons until the very moment of impact. The violence of the air war ended abruptly at the tree line. The wreckage of Harvey's horse was scattered across the fields of Henstedt-Ulzburg. The main fuselage had disintegrated upon impact. Of the 11 men aboard the aircraft, the survival rate was miraculous, yet tragic. 6 men died in the crash, or the immediate descent. 5 managed to bail out, but the tail section lay apart from the rest. It had landed separately, a solitary aluminum tomb resting in the damp April soil. When the German recovery teams approached the severed tail, they found the body of Staff Sergeant Arizona Harris still strapped into his seat. The cold had preserved the scene, freezing the final moments of the battle in time. But what struck the witnesses, and later the Graves registration teams, was not just the tragedy of the death, but the condition of the weapons. The ammunition boxes feeding the twin 50 caliber machine guns were empty. The evidence was undeniable. Harris had not died instantly when the tail was severed. He had not lost consciousness in the fall. In those terrifying minutes of free fall, tumbling through the freezing air without a pilot, without a future, and without hope, he had held the triggers down. He had fired until the belts ran dry, or the ground rose up to meet him. He had spent his final heartbeat doing exactly what he had sworn to do, defending his ship, even when the ship was gone. The citation for the Distinguished Service Cross, which he would receive posthumously, put it into stiff, formal military language. Fighting with his guns until the severed tail struck the ground. But the reality on the ground was more visceral. It was a testament to a kind of courage that transcends orders. It was the refusal to go quietly. In the cold light of strategic analysis, the sacrifice of the Luftwaffe pilots on that day was a catastrophic failure. The Nazi high command had gambled on terror. They believed that the sight of German pilots turning themselves into missiles would break the morale of the American crews. They were wrong. While the loss of Harvey's horse was tragic, it was statistically negligible. The 8th Air Force did not recoil. They simply closed the gaps in their formations and flew on. The industrial might of the United States could replace a B-17 in a matter of days. But the Luftwaffe was spending its last, non-renewable resource: its youth. The collision tactic proved to be a desperate spasm rather than a game changer. The exchange ratio was unsustainable. Ultimately, the event served only to highlight the total moral collapse of the Third Reich. A regime that had begun the war by bombing defenseless cities was ending it by ordering its own children to die in a mathematically impossible attempt to alter gravity. Yet amidst this industrial slaughter and ideological nihilism, the story of Arizona Harris survived. It traveled through the barracks of the 448th Bomb Group, passed from crew to crew in the mess halls of East Anglia. It became more than a war story. It became a totem of resilience. In a war defined by overwhelming technology and impersonal destruction, the image of one man alone in a falling metal box, refusing to give up, struck a chord that resonated far deeper than any strategic victory. War is a collision of machines, but it is defined by the men inside them. We build fortresses of aluminum and steel, equipping them with the finest engineering the world can offer. Yet we ultimately rely on the fragile, terrifying courage of 20-year-old boys to make them work. The collision over Kiel reveals the ultimate dichotomy of conflict. The Sonderkommando Elbe represented the total devaluation of human life, a system feeding its young into a furnace for a lost cause. In stark contrast, Arizona Harris represented the ultimate affirmation of duty. His final act was not one of hatred, but of protection. In those seconds of freefall, stripped of his wings, his pilot, and his future, he remained faithful to his post. It forces us to ask ourselves, what keeps a man fighting when all hope is extinguished? It was not the orders of a distant general, nor the politics of nations. It was the simple, unbreakable bond between a gunner and his crew. He fought the gravity of the earth and the tyranny of the enemy simultaneously. History often focuses on the victors and the survivors. We tally the medals and the tonnages, but the true cost of victory is paid in the quiet, unseen moments of impossible bravery. Arizona Harris teaches us that while metal can be sheared and aircraft can be destroyed, the will to resist is indestructible. He rode the wreckage down not as a victim, but as a warrior, ensuring that the very last thing the enemy heard was not the scream of a falling man, but the roar of American defiance.